The reason that I play cheap gear is because I have no money. Okay, so that's really only part of the reason. It's a big part, but it's only a part. The other part is that cheap gear tends to work just as well as expensive gear, at least for my purposes anyway. In this video, I want to show you how much mileage you can get out of a completely cheap rig, as well as why I actually kind of prefer it over more expensive stuff. Expensive gear definitely has its place too, but we'll get to that. So cheap or budget gear has had a bad stigma for being unreliable and of low quality, and while that was certainly true at a certain point in history, it's definitely not true now. So what's changed? What makes cheap gear viable in 2020? And the short answer is mostly manufacturing advances. They sure don't make them like they used to. Thank God, because the way they used to make them was not that great. And I will argue with any of you over that, and I will win, not because I'm good at arguing. No, it's because I'm actually right on this one. This time I'm right. So the bass that you can go down to Guitar Center and buy brand new isn't that much different from the bass that your grandpa played. The fundamental design for basses hasn't changed since the 50s, really. Where most of the changes and improvements have been made are in manufacturing process, especially for low-end, cheap, entry-level guitars. I'm talking about things like CNC machines, where you can load in like a 2D or 3D template, and then a robot goes and cuts them all out, and they're all identical. They didn't have that in 1950. So as this technology has improved and matured, guitars have only gotten better, and the processes for making guitars have only gotten cheaper. Automation advances allows for more consistent and precise and less labor-intensive work, which means that you get better guitars for less work. And I should mention that just about any mass-produced guitar is this way, whether it's $2,000 or $100. They're all mass-produced the same way. And yeah, I don't want to dismiss boutique guitars that are made by hand. That's a whole separate thing, not what we're talking about today, because almost none of those boutique handmade guitars are cheap. Getting back to my point, why, if all guitars and basses are made pretty much the same way, are some of them cheap and some of them expensive? And it really comes down to just two things: quality of materials and quality assurance. High-end guitars are made from the best materials money can buy. You've got high-quality wood, the cuts are hand-picked so that there are no knots or warping in them, really high-quality electronics and hardware. Additionally, once you have all of these pieces put together, you have a tech that will go through and make sure that everything is dialed in with precision to their specification. Cheaper instruments, on the other hand, use cheaper wood, they'll use whatever cuts of wood, and they use lower quality hardware and electronics. These two factors, quality of materials and quality assurance, created an enormous divide between high quality guitars and cheap guitars. If you bought a cheapo guitar back in the day, you could fully expect it to just fall apart after a couple of years. Part of me thinks this is why vintage instruments are held in such high regard, because anything that was any good in those days has survived, and anything that sucked has fallen apart and been thrown away. These days that divide is much smaller, because even lower tier guitars are held to a much higher standard. However, the one thing you do have to look out for in lower tier guitars is that the quality assurance can be a little inconsistent. I'm working on a video right now where I go through my process of checking out a guitar. Once I get that up, I'm gonna put it right up in this spot. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so that you get notified when I've got it up. You can get a perfectly serviceable and great sounding instrument for very little cash, and frankly, because they're cheap, if anything happens to it, they're easy to fix or replace. You can also stop worrying about it getting ruined because it's only a couple $100. Like, what's the big deal? Because no matter how careful you are, somebody is gonna run into your guitar or tip it over or bump into you or whatever. So if you have a cheap guitar and it gets dinged up, it's like, eh. If you have a $2,500 beautiful, flawless instrument, do you even want to take it out of the house? So with all of these upsides, what are you actually giving up by going with a cheap instrument over an expensive one? And it's sound quality. It's sound quality. That's what's worse about cheap guitars. But, and this is a big but, sound quality matters way less in a live setting than you might think. You're playing to a room of 250 people and you're plugged into the same outlet as the Budweiser sign, and I just really have a hard time thinking that anybody's gonna care that your bass sounds just a little bit better. Like, I just think after you get past a certain point, it just doesn't matter that much. Like, as long as you're making bass sounding noises, people are gonna be okay with that. And the exception here is, like, if you're doing professional level studio recordings, then yeah, sound quality matters quite a lot. But again, I think you can overcome a lot of deficiencies in tone by playing well, having a good performance, by having great songs, by investing in good production and having a good master. Like, those things matter way more than having a $3,000 Sadowski over just like whatever Squier instrument you have. Actually, if you wanted to just go experience the difference for yourself, I've got a Spotify playlist down below, which is just a bunch of recordings that I've played on, and I did most of them with this bass. This is just a Squier Classic Vibe Precision that I've had for like 10 years, and I just recorded it into a GarageBand for a lot of them, but then they were sent off to like professional recording studios for finalization. So check that out if you want to see how this actually translates into a professional environment. So getting back to sound quality, there are a ton of videos on YouTube that will pit like a $50 bass, the cheapest bass they could find, against their like $3,000 Fodera or something. And those comparisons are so pointless. Like, of course the $3,000 bass is gonna sound better. Like, there's no question about it. So what I'm more interested in is finding the point at which cheap is good enough. How little money can you spend and get a good instrument? What is the point at which quality and price intersect? And in my experience, it's about $300 to $400 is all. So what basses exist around this mark? Well, I actually have 3 right here that I can show you. And then I'll also mention a few others that I don't own but I can still recommend. First one is the Squier Classic Vibe Precision that I already mentioned. This one's in beautiful Fiesta Red. I bought this in 2012 for like $250 because the music shop had had it for a while and they just wanted to get rid of it. And if you've been following my channel for any length of time, you know that I have gigged the absolute hell out of this thing. Like, this has been on so many recordings and to so many shows, and this thing has gone to New York and back. The only modification that I've done to this bass was to change the pick guard out, because the stock one is kind of like poopy, tort looking. Actually, let me go get it, I'll show you. So this is the old pick guard. You can see what that looks like. I think it looks pretty bad, and I think that the white looks a lot better. Might go to black at some point. I don't know. I can do whatever I want because it's all Fender stuff and you can swap parts out really easy. Anyway, so if you haven't figured it out by now, this is my absolute favorite bass. This is my baby, and I highly recommend it to anyone just starting out. It's such a quality bass for the money. And in fact, the entire Classic Vibe line is really, really great. And I think recently Fender actually bumped up the price on them because their reputation had just gotten so good. I cannot tell you how many times that I've had guys come up to the stage like between breaks on a set, and they'll just double take when they see the headstock. They just cannot believe what they're hearing as a Squier. If you want one of these, Fender does still make this line and they're still great, but these have been around for a long time, so you can also find them used. So you can just check out your Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist in your area and maybe you'll get lucky. Similar to the Squier Classic Vibe line is this, the Vintage Modified line. It's really similar. So this is the Jazz Bass version in Arctic White. I think I got this in 2013 from some random guy on talkbass.com, and I think I paid $300 for it. I got lucky because this is definitely a decent bass, but I don't recommend buying things online sight unseen. I guess I just sort of figured that the kind of person who would hang out on Talkbass and buy and sell gear would probably know what he was doing, and yeah, it's a decent bass for sure. So while I think this bass is okay, I don't think it's nearly as good as the Classic Vibe Precision I have, and that's kind of the sentiment that I've seen online, is that the vintage modified basses aren't as good as the Classic Vibe ones, but your experience might differ. The only other thing that I've done on this bass is that for some reason the tone pot just quit. And when I took it into the tech to get it fixed, he said that in the 20 years that he's been fixing instruments, he's never seen a tone pot just quit. It just stopped working for some reason. I don't know. So anyway, that was probably just a specific problem with this bass. I don't think it's a widespread problem for the VM line. But Fender doesn't really make these anymore, so you might as well just go with the Classic Vibe because they're just better anyway. Oh, also on a side note, if you want to go with an actual Fender instead of Squier, like if you're insecure about the name on the headstock, the Fender Made in Mexico basses are excellent as well. I've known lots of gigging bass players that use those, and they're really happy with them and they sound great, and yeah, totally viable too if you want to spend just a little bit more than $300 or $400. But definitely worth noting is that the Squier instruments are basically all built to Fender's spec, so if you want to start with a Squier and then upgrade parts as you go along, that's 100% doable because everything will just bolt on together. Like Leo Fender was onto something. So obviously I'm a big Fender guy, I love Fender basses, but I do also have a Music Man Sterling Stingray. I like this thing too. I picked this up just a couple months ago for about 250 bucks from a Guitar Center because it had this little owie at the bottom. But yeah, it's a very, very nice playing instrument, and I've gotten a lot of compliments on the way it sounds. Where this one suffers the most, I think, is just with the EQ. It's not as responsive as I would like, but it works okay. Now that I'm thinking of it, I made a whole series of videos about how you can change your tone with just using your fingers. I'll put that up right here if you want to go check that out. So that's how I've been working around the limitations of the EQ, is just by altering my playing, and that's been working just fine. I am planning on doing a full demo and review of this bass at some point in the future, so keep an eye out for that. So two brands that are honorable mentions are Yamaha and Ibanez. I used to own an SR400 and an ATK 300. Both of those were Ibanez basses, and they were great. I really, really miss that ATK. You may have seen this video at some point, and yeah, that's that bass. Oh, that bass is cool. I sold it to a friend and he still has it. I might buy it back at some point. I don't know. But yeah, also the Yamaha basses, I've tried tons of them in the $300 to $400 range, and all of them have been really solid, and I really liked them. Brands like Epiphone and Schecter and Cort, I don't even really like their high-end guitars, so I can't really recommend their entry-level stuff, but other people like them, I just don't. Really, the only brand I feel like I can tell you to just actively avoid completely is Dean. Those instruments are firewood. Don't buy Dean. Dean basses are garbage. So far in this video, I've just talked about basses, but you can actually get away with cheap amps as well. You just have to know what your needs are, and for most people, what you need to be able to do is be heard over a drum set and be able to plug into a house system. Now the good news is that if your amp fulfills the first requirement of being loud enough, chances are it has an XLR out, which will allow you to plug into venues' house systems. So when people recommend amps, they'll typically tell you to look at the wattage as a measurement of power, but I actually prefer to look at speaker size. In my experience, the absolute bare minimum that you can get away with is either a single 15-inch speaker or to have two 10-inch speakers. If you find an amp with either of those speaker configurations, I can almost 100% guarantee you that it's got an XLR out on it. So what am I gigging with now? I'm glad you asked. So until recently, I was using this Ampeg PF500, and then it bit the dust, and I don't know how to fix it. And I don't want to send it into Ampeg. Anyway, this was a good amp until it stopped working. I don't know if you can just barely see it down here, but this is the amp that I've gotten to replace it. This is a Fender Rumble 500. And it has two 10-inch speakers and an XLR out, and it is great. I really like it. I've rehearsed with it, I've gigged with it, and it's fantastic. It seems to be plenty loud, it sounds great, and it's really light. And I was able to pick it up used for 300 bucks from some guy I found on Facebook Marketplace. In the past, I've also played through the equivalent GK and Ampeg combos, and they're about the same. They're just fine. They perform about the same way, and they're just as good. However, I will say that the Fender combo is about 200 bucks less new than the GK, and it's 10 pounds less than the Ampeg amp. So something to consider there. For me, I'm a giant wuss. I like having the lighter amp because I'm dragging it in and out of rehearsal spaces, in and out of venues, and with the way I've got my setup now, I can load in one trip. So assuming you have to buy everything new, you're into it about 600 bucks for an amp, 400 bucks for a bass, and then like 30 bucks for a cable. So then for about $1,000, you're completely gig ready. We did it, Reddit! Thank you for watching my video. If this was helpful or entertaining to you, please give me a like. The thumbs up helps me a lot. And please do subscribe for more videos. I'm on track to release at least one video a month, probably two, but at least one video a month. And your support really motivates me to keep these up. I almost forgot to mention, I've got a show next month with my rock opera, Deep Love. So we're playing at the Velour in Provo on Valentine's Day, February 14th. It's a double header, so 2 shows one night. Do come check it out if you're in the area. It's super unique and really, really good. Also, I'm doing a fun little series over on TikTok called The Naked Bassline, where I play a bass line, you try and guess what the song is. My handle is whiteguyNumber7. Come check it out, it's a lot of fun.